So much to talk about. So much to talk about. But before we dive into the film, I just want to talk to you a little bit about your background. You know, we all have an interesting route when we talk about filmmakers. And you definitely had an interesting one. Patrick was an economics major at MIT and worked in the business world for many years before diving into film. So can you talk a little bit about your journey into you know, that side of the world, coming into your first film and how that all sort of came about?
Yeah, I guess as much as I can remember it, because it feels like a series of accidents, bit by bit. When I was in school for economics, I was also starting to see a lot of theater and get involved with some French theater in Boston, and I learned a lot from that. You know, sitting in the audience, and then eventually starting a theater company. It was where I learned how to work with and talk with a wide variety of actors, and where I got to learn design. I had no art background, and so I always thought when I started directing theater that was my weakness. And I was very lucky to have designers, very experienced people who were just happy to say, this is how I see things, this is how I do my work, this is what I do. And so it really demystified. For someone who's on the outside and who came to it very late in life, it's a wonderful way to be welcomed into art. It's just, okay, you have questions, we'll answer them, we'll work together, and to be mentored by a number of different designers. And then I moved to New York, and I continued the acting, mostly in theater and then some in TV and film. And I think I came to my first film. I wrote the script, and I didn't think I would direct, I didn't think I would produce or do anything else. And like I'm sure a lot of filmmakers will recognize, you just kind of do it as a defensive move. Right. It's, you know, you're worried about what will happen to it in somebody else's hands. For good reason. You hear them talk about what they're going to do to it. Sure. In their hands. And so you're just like, no. It's, you want it, you want to defend it, you want it to exist in this particular way. You are warned against it by, you know, for every which way, and maybe with reason. But you're like, no, I would still like this particular thing to exist in the world.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really interesting route. And then with your first film, of course, I think it's really great and inspiring for a lot of young filmmakers. You make your first film, and these films are self-financed. Mm-hmm. You're diving into your first film, never having made a film before. You go into the festival circuit, and so for the first 6 months, you said, right?
Yeah, it's more accurate to say I tried to go into the film
right.
festival circuit, and it was hard to, for reasons I don't understand, it was hard to get people to see and enjoy the first film. And yeah, but I think, you know, it's kind of nice being an outsider sometimes because you just have no idea how things work.
Sure.
And so you just kind of bumble around and you said, okay, well, I'm learning and I'll try this and I'll try all these other things. And a lot of times you don't know that, you know, that is ill-advised.
Right.
Or, and I think that definitely art forms need both. You know, you need your insiders who bring a certain kind of linearity and passion from all, you know, to dedicate their lives to things. And you need outsiders who maybe through some of their bumbling and strange imaginings can contribute another type of thing.
Sure.
And so, yeah, there was a lot of learning in that process to figure out how do people see this film.
Right.
And you would think it gets easier the second time, or you would know something for the second one.
Sure.
But no.
Well, that route's gotten easier because, so you had, I mean, I think it goes to speak to your persistence and your belief in your material. 30 festivals pass on you and you're still not giving up. You're still looking for that audience, right? And you figure out a way to get it out there on your own, basically, and discover this audience, which came from really interesting places, as we talked about.
Yeah, you know, so it was, you know, you try to get it into festivals and that didn't work, and I found a way to screen for distributors. This is the first film I'm talking about, and that didn't quite work. And so I thought, okay, what's left? And then, okay, maybe critics and people. And so I'm like, okay, we'll run it for a week in New York. And it was pretty much at the time, and maybe there are even more options that I can't even think of any now, but that was probably the last option.
Yeah.
And if it didn't work, then okay. But it did work in that it found individual champions. And I think that, you talk about things turning around. I don't think, at least the lessons I learned from the first film weren't that. It's not that one thing changes the film. What I learned is that, I don't understand the industry and the system as a whole, but individuals can still have a role to play.
Right.
An individual kind of instigated tonight and tomorrow the events of that. An individual found a way for me to enter another whole country and find an audience there. I think that what began when I started showing the movie in New York was that I found this string of individuals who could, in their way, they look modest from the outside,
Sure.
but they were just everything to a filmmaker who had nothing
Right.
before.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it got phenomenal reviews, right? And obviously that sort of changed this sort of the outlook for that film moving forward. Had a much different experience with this film. Premiered at South by Southwest.
Right.
And went on to play at Cannes.
Right.
So how is this different? I know you mentioned that the difficulties still exist in both films, and you think you learned from the first one. How has it been different with sort of this added, maybe even pressure of expectations that people have about your work?
Yeah, well, there's that, and you never know quite what's in the mix, but I suspect it's some of that. I really didn't know what would happen with this film because it is quite different, technically and in many ways from the first film. And the beautiful thing is that, when it played in Cannes, it had a beautiful trajectory there where, it was distributed in France last year and it did amazingly well for an independent film. Everybody was both shocked and pleased.
Sure.
And I have to say that lifted some of the pressure from me because more people saw it in France in the theaters than ever saw in the family worldwide.
Wow.
And it saved me from, I think, a fate of banging my head against the wall here, trying to figure out how to squeeze it into a system that wasn't particularly interested in it. And so I'm grateful for that.
Sure.
But I don't think the people themselves are different. When I'm at screenings in France and here, there is the same beautiful mix of responses.
Yeah.
People who love the film for the same reasons I love it. People who hate the film for the reasons I love it. I don't think the people themselves are any different, but the trajectory has ended up very different.
Sure.
And then part of that is a difference in me, in that I feel, you get older, you have more finite energy.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, well, it already lives somewhere. And I don't have to work as hard here, and then it lets me, maybe think about the next thing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing to look at this film and just realize that it's your second film. I mean, because your patience and confidence in your material and the actors is pretty impressive. I mean, it's really amazing. And then speaking from a technical standpoint, I know you shot this in 16.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting. The reason why you shot it in 16, because that's something that I really haven't heard before. But if you could share with us why.
It's something my producer still doesn't believe. But I told my DP, this is a script, he read the script, and I told him, we're going to shoot it in 2 weeks. And he said, okay, we have to shoot film. His experience has been that when he has an impossible day, one of his big tools is to shoot film. In his mind, it makes everything go faster. Technically, for some lighting things, film can kind of cover up some of your little shortcuts here and there. It can do some of the work for you.
Sure.
And it also demands something of you in that there's no practice. Everything's real.
Right.
And it also slims down, you don't have a monitor, you don't have somebody in charge of that monitor, in charge of these other things. It slims down and streamlines your crew in a way. And I like that. And I also like what film does for your design. in that, you know, and especially once we saw the tests, you can design to your eye, and especially the relationships of film color holds. People could just look at the set, and so you don't have this march around the monitor. You know, you look through the camera, but you can just look on your set and design to the eye, and that speeds things up too.
Right. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. It's shot in 2 weeks, you said,
2
right?
weeks,
14
yeah.
days.
12 days.
12 days. So 12 days with a crew of 8, shot on 60mm film, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty impressive. So talk to us about what about this material? This is an adaptation.
Yeah.
Your first film was an original screenplay. What about the book and the story sort of drew you to jumping into this as your second project?
That's a good question. I read this book, a beautiful book by the same name, The Grief of Others, and I learned something from it. Not a fact. I thought lessons that would help me in seeing other people, understanding other people, the lessons I could apply to my life.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's great. It's and maybe a rarity. And I thought, well, it would be nice if we could share this with more people in a different medium, and maybe I can also continue to think about those things I've learned. And I had an opportunity I'm not sure I'll ever have again, because it's a friend of mine who wrote the novel, and I've known her for over a decade, and it's so beautiful when you are collaborating with another artist and there aren't 10 layers of people between you, 4 agents and lawyers and all these things. And I'll just give you an example. I could ask her, well, I showed her the script, and I want to make sure she was happy about it, and she came back to me and she had questions. And they were perfectly reasonable questions, and she would ask me, for example, will people understand this, and will this work? And as another artist, I could tell her, I don't know. That's why we make the movie, to see if we can make it work. And I can tell her, some of my strategies and my thinking about how we navigate that edge.
Sure.
But, it's harder to tell that to a lawyer. It's harder to tell that to, certain types of producers.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I don't know. And I think that kind of honesty and constant input from her, to keep you honest, to make sure, we're not going off track here.
Sure.
I don't know if I'll ever have that again.
So you worked pretty closely with her through the script writing process, would you say? Or the
We
development
had
process?
rounds of interaction.
Okay.
Constant would maybe be a little too much, but maybe throughout the life of the film, we checked in with each other half a dozen times.
Okay.
On key things.
Okay.
And then she visited the set.
Gotcha.
A couple days, yeah.
And there were some interesting choices you made in the film. The play with time, I thought was really interesting. Now, was the book linear, or is that something you decided to sort of change as you sort of developed this into a screenplay?
The form of the book was pretty complex in that it jumped between a lot of different time periods.
Okay.
And it included a big section that was a time period I left out, which is the time they were at the lake, when Jess is looking at those photos and they talk about their time, the first time Jess spent time with his family. And I didn't know how we would crack that at first. That was the most complex thing. Now, even though the novel's not linear, it's broken up like this, once you're in a section, you tend to be in there for a long time. And then I'm not quite sure when it came, but when this sort of second act, where there's a couple of repetitions and things are all out of order, and somehow to me it made a kind of emotional sense. And it seemed, what I rely on is less the structure of the novel and more our abilities as human beings. Like when we meet people, we meet them in the present tense. I know you today.
Right.
And maybe as we get to know each other better, I learn a little piece of your past, and then that informs what I think of you. And then I'll learn another piece, and then I have to kind of put them all together. And I think that, we learn about people out of order.
Sure.
And so one of the things I try to do in how films reveal information is to take advantage of the fact that, I'm not making a film for bears. This is for human beings who have had human experiences and do certain things very well and can fill in certain gaps very quickly. That's great, because then I don't have to worry about that and I can move on to the next thing.
Sure.
Yeah, but when I figured out the middle act, that worked in a kind of like, again, not an emotional sense and a development of my understanding of this history of these characters, I knew, okay, we had kind of cracked the nut of adaptation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I thought you did a fantastic job. I mean, I think it works really well in the way that you approached it. What about your process with the cast, as I mentioned? I mean, it seems like, I mean, the type of material that you make and the way that you approach it and the way that you distribute and the way that you make these films even aesthetically, it's really interesting. It comes off as like really sort of an outside the box thinker. His first movie was 3 hours long, which again, from industry standards, it's something that we would be like, don't make a movie that's 3 hours long. Don't do certain things. If you're gonna go make a movie and you want distribution, go try to get a name talent. It seems like you stay really committed to sort of what your idea is, who these characters are. How did the casting process work with the second film? Did that ever play a factor in sort of your thinking? Did the length of the film play a factor?
Not in terms of these ends of the life it will have. I think I fall in love with certain things and then I can't hurt them.
Sure.
And so like the first film, I fell in love with, the way it revealed people and the tempo at which it revealed people. And, and so and it's the same thing when I see an actor, I fall in love with the actor before I fall in love with dollar signs associated with that actor.
Sure.
And I actually, casting was almost the same.
Yeah.
In that it was mostly open casting, and I love meeting new talent. Okay. Because I think I have sort of different priorities than a lot of people who cast and think about actors.
Sure.
And so in some ways I would never know if this talent exists because it's not valued the same way I value it. And so you kind of have to go out there yourself to search it out and to see that it exists. And it's always really nice to know it does. And yeah, now the length, I always knew this film because it's more experimental, in a number of different directions. And it's also, it's an ensemble piece. And so it's more disjoint. You don't have this strong central spine to hold on to the whole time. And because of that, I always knew it would be more compact. It's just, that's our tolerance level, I think, for the degree of experimentation that's in this film.
Right.
And also, things have to be more compact so that they echo each other better, It kind of gives forces a consistency to them. And I feel like that was another reason I was excited to shoot in 2 weeks. Because when something is aesthetically all over the map, you want to try to find some coherent forces. And sometimes time is your coherent force. I forget things very easily. And if the fact that on my last day of shooting, the first day of shooting was last week, that helps. That helps keep you from stylistic drift and other kinds of things.
Right. And you also, your stylistic choices are very, very distinct to me and unique. Again, in the way you're patient with sort of the scenes that flow. There's some interesting choices you make within scenes where you stick to the person's reactions instead of moving along with the other actors. Does this come from your theater background, or who are your influences? Like, where does it come from to approach your filmmaking in this sort of really patient way where you let these scenes and the performances sort of unfold?
I think the influences may be just more human. It's where I think the interesting information is, or where I think people reveal themselves. And it's often at the fringes of their actions, in quieter moments, or in how they're responding to someone.
Sure.
And so I think that I go in and I generally don't know where I'm looking, who I'm looking at. And I just mentally move my camera all around the room, every which place, fling it into unexpected places. And they all teach me something, even if they teach me not where to be. And then I just think about those different flows of information. And then usually I find there's a sweet spot. There's a place where you're getting all the right positive information. You're missing all the right information, because it's nice to miss some information too.
Sure.
And in particular, for a film like this, where you're in a lot of domestic spaces, you feel the spatial relationship between the characters, and you can read the body language between the characters, because I think there's a lot of information there. And so that tells me that, you know, we are not in close-up too often,
Right.
in the film, and it's because I want to read the body language and the spatial relationship between these two characters and what they're expressing in that.
And are you doing that approach on set, or do you have a specific shot list or ideas about?
Yeah, you know, I said I do it in my mind first,
Uh-huh.
because it's cheaper. Time there is cheaper.
Sure.
And usually I have a moment where I'm like, that's the place. And sometimes I end up on set and I'm like, I was wrong.
Right.
And I'll give you an example from the film. You know, when John comes home drunk and is in the foyer with Ricky in that long scene where she finally reveals that she knew about the baby.
Yeah, it's a great scene.
Great scene, and I had it all wrong. I had it all wrong. I thought that it was going to be, you know, which is rare for this film, basically reverse shot.
Okay.
And I was going to be handheld on each of the actors. And I remember that was our strategy, and it was going to be this fun dance with the cinematographer and the actors. And Frank, the cinematographer, and I were just like, okay, let's watch rehearsal. We always like to be in the room to watch rehearsal, to understand what they're doing. And it's a tiny space.
Yeah.
And so the only place we could kind of be out of the way was in the corner, and there were these apple boxes stacked there. And so we just climbed up on the boxes and stood in the corner there. We watched the scene from there, and, you know, everybody started preparing for for the shoot after the rehearsal. I was just like, you know, it looked really nice from up here. And they weren't moving as much as I thought they would. And the way, if we went closer to them, the way we were thinking of,
Right.
I think the camera language would speak louder than their own language. And again, like we just talked about the body language.
Right.
So much of it in that scene that I would lose from the individual coverage. And so sometimes it's a beautiful accident like that tells you, this is better than what you had in mind.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And what about these moments? And, you know, there's a moment with the wife and the husband as he was leaving, when they were talking about Jess and him feeling like he's being controlled. And I think there's a scene with Gordy and Jess as well, where you're just sticking, like, we never see the other person's face. Is that a conscious choice that you make? And why do you go that route as opposed to going back and forth? And again, is that about space and body language?
I think that is more about psychology.
Okay.
Because I think sometimes when we cut away from characters, we miss them making decisions or deciding not to do something. We sometimes we are so biased towards action and speech that we miss what they don't say or what's hard for them to say.
Right.
And what's hard for them to say is not how they choke up when they say something. It's it's the moments leading up to it. And so I think a lot of that is to give them better psychological context for where they are in the moment. And usually in those times, I'm on the person who is more surprising. And if I did cut to the other person, I would gain no more information than you just hearing them. And so usually in those situations, I stick where the unusual information is. Again, it's information flow. I feel there's information there and not so much in the others, or that the information in the others is not tricky. You can get it from just their voice.
Gotcha. And do you get coverage, or are you just like, you see it and you're like, this is it, we're moving on?
I don't get coverage.
You don't get coverage?
Yeah, that was a fight on the first film. Because especially when you're a first-time filmmaker, everybody's like, you know, and so many first-time filmmakers regret not having coverage.
Sure.
But I'm like, no, because I think that it's a kind of safety or hedge that weakens your approach. I think you should figure it out. You should figure, and also when I don't get coverage, I can't rely on coverage, right? So I have to know it works. I have to see it work on set, and I can't move on until I know it works.
Right.
And then I know I have the scene. I don't have to wonder about it,
Right.
later and figure out if I have to create it. I know it exists.
Yeah. No, it's great. And this film, it's premiered at South by Play at Cannes. You've been very sort of specific about the way that you released the film. I mean, we feel really fortunate that we were able to bring it here and watch it. What's your thought process behind that, and why are you just not? I mean, you told us that you don't send out screeners, which is interesting. But
nobody believes me. They ask for a screener, and I say, well, we don't have screeners for this film.
Yeah.
And they say, it's hard for us to watch it anyway. If you could just send the screener. We really don't have screeners for this film. And, it's first film I sent out screeners. It's not a hardline philosophy about screeners. This film, it's about the dangers of isolation. And I think, well, we should probably not watch it alone. It has a lot of details in the vibration of one image over the other, which is delicate, and I think best seen on a big screen. And my thinking, so a number of these things kind of added into each other into this decision to that if people were interested in it, I could give them a master format that they could screen. And I think the other thing is, I believe the form fundamentally changes what a thing is. And if I'm partnering with someone, okay, we figure out what we're going to do together. I wouldn't prohibit you from sending out screeners if a distributor wanted to do that. But if it's me, I am the filmmaker caring for this, I'm not going to shoot my film in the foot. I'm not going to be the one to hobble my film.
Right.
In the name of what? If anything I've learned, it's that the gains are so small, you might as well have integrity, And I'm like, let's just have great screenings where we join each other in the room, and and actually say that that's important. We are important. And what I love is that it's led to very interesting things. For example, some festivals, the programmers never sit and watch a film together. And in several years of programming this one festival, I had a screening for these programmers. They all came. It's like, this is the first time we've all watched a film together.
Oh, wow. So you put that together.
Yeah. And so it's sometimes a mix of things. It's not easy, but I think convenience is sort of a false master. All the beautiful things in the world are rather inconvenient.
Sure.
And I like that. And it's been good for me because, this film could have played at many, many places, and I would be sending things here and there, and I wouldn't be knowing, and I think the quality of the screenings would definitely go down. The attendance, all these things would go down. And this is a way for me also to focus my energy. It's kind of like, okay, I find a partner who is as odd as I am, or at least accepts how odd I am.
Sure.
And is willing to continue the conversation. And okay, they might be interesting people, and they might be willing to do more to help this screening.
Sure.
It's not just to have a screening, but it's to have a meaningful screening. Yeah.
And the whole audience thing is really interesting, that you found an audience in France, of all places. Again, sort of breaking this model. They say American dramas don't necessarily work, in the foreign market. What do you think about your film's resonates over there? What's been some interesting reactions that you've gotten that people are connecting to?
One of the things I've been very happy about what travels is there is more laughter in France than anywhere. And they say that's one of the things that doesn't travel well, is the comic moments. But every single comic moment is alive in France, and I love that. I don't know. I think that part of what is really helps is that France still has a public infrastructure. It's messy, it's not perfect, but it supports distributors. It supports theaters that play less commercial films.
Right.
And it supports them with dollars. And that's the reason that minority voices can live in that film environment. I think the French also are wonderful conversers. And they talk a lot to each other. The way the film, critics and film fans and filmmakers, they talk a lot. And I love it. I think that strength of community has helped find an audience there. But when it comes down to the people, I don't think they're all that different. Although I did have one, I think my favorite question in a Q&A session was very French. They saw the movie, and this gentleman raised his hand, and he's just like, why are they always eating cold food? It's like, I think this family would be much happier if they cooked together.
That's funny. And was that a deliberate choice on your end?
No, but it is right in a way, because
Yeah.
the film is about ceremony and kind of the ways we participate in life together, and that is something that fractures.
Right.
This idea of a joint meal versus whatever's convenient
Sure.
again for the night.
And you mentioned that this process, obviously, there are a couple things that are different. The struggles are the same, but it did free you up a little bit and enabled you to write during this process for your next project.
Yeah.
What are you working on next? And
It is it's an original film. It's actually a pair of films, and I absolutely don't know what to call them.
okay.
They are so curious. I think a friend of mine read them, and he said two things that I'll take. I'll take this as a response. He said, it's the most tender of anything you've written and the funniest.
Okay.
So
Drama.
it's actually far less on that. I think comedy is the
Okay.
dominant mode. But in the same way with drama, I will just pull whatever works, I think, to support drama.
Sure.
And so what's been beautiful about this comedy is I'll just take whatever works. And so sometimes you have something that is Tati, sometimes you have something that's Airplane, sometimes you have something that's Oscar Wilde. It's all these, I think they all have a place
Yeah.
in this particular piece. And it's been fun to see how they just naturally emerge and fit together.
Right. And when you say two parts, I don't think they quite understand, but Patrick is making basically two movies at the same. He's doing what Star Wars did, or
Exactly what Star
Lord of the
Wars did,
Rings
yeah.
did. Yeah, yeah. But he's making two movies. What's the thought process behind that? Is it financial or?
No, it's if it's financial, I'm doing it wrong. It's going in the wrong direction. It's just that there's more stuff. And I remember when I first had the idea for the film, and I realized, well, if I just think of it as a little longer, suddenly like a dozen other films I had been working on or thinking about or had even written all kind of fit into this film.
Sure.
And all wanted to fit into this film. So I'm like, okay, it's longer. And then I didn't know if it was going to be a mini-series or something else, but something happened where I understood the structure. The content itself split the film. Unfortunately, and maybe someone knows here, I don't know what to call two films.
I don't know.
I've just been calling it a pair of films, sequels, but I don't.
Right. And are you going to release? How does the release work on that? Do you release one next year and then release the second part?
Man,
the
I
year
haven't even
after?
made it yet.
Okay.
It's just like one step at a
Just
time.
once all right, interesting. And then also Patrick's holding, as they mentioned, holding a workshop on distribution. You have a really interesting approach, I think. Had a really interesting approach with your first film. What is your approach with this film in regards to ultimately getting it out there? You seem to tend to do some really interesting out-of-box things, as with the next film that you're doing with the distribution of the first film. What's your game plan or approach with this film at this point?
It changes all the time, and I think that's what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow is that it's less about do this than how do we ask questions of what's going on and what do we want and how do we get there. And as the world changes, that answer will have to change. As you change,
Sure.
it'll have to change. But one of the things that's new to me in my thinking is, I'm out of the infancy of distribution into the world. And there's a longer game, which is I would like my films to survive me. And that's a kind of care we're talking about, not just, this year, next year at release. It's 10 years, 20 years into the future. And it's a different kind of thinking. So I've been thinking a lot about that. And I think what it's helped me do is be okay to the idea that, right now may not be the right time for this film to be released everywhere.
Sure.
What's important is that it still exists, and the next film will help this film in the way this film has helped the previous film. When Grief played in France, there were at least a dozen theaters that played in the family too. And so at some point, I've played very few countries, and in many countries I suspect I will enter with a retrospective.
Sure.
But I think what's important is that these films exist, that you're always thinking about how it might find its way to people. But when the time is not right, you're not forcing the issue.
Right.
Yeah.
Super patient. You're patient with your films. You're patient with your distribution. I think it works. Patrick also has a book that you created, which is really interesting, called Postscript. You guys can catch it on iTunes, on iBooks. And it sort of goes through the process of giving us a real deep insight into the process of making The Grief of Others. Really, really interesting in-depth transparency into the whole process. Why was that important to you? Why did you go about? I mean, that's an extra step that you think as a filmmaker. I'm like, it's hard enough trying to make a movie, and then you have this book that is unbelievable. But what was the importance in the process in making that book?
Thank you. Well, one of the nice things is we didn't make them at the same time, so we could make the movie and then we could come back and start working on the book. But David Chen and I, he's been a friend and he's a fellow filmmaker, and we've been talking about working together. We wanted to work together on Grief of Others. We didn't know how. So we threw that out one night, and then a couple months later, I said, I think I have an idea. And you probably see a lot of these Kickstarter events and the projects, and the very first reward is usually updates or behind the scenes from the film. And I thought, well, that's nice, but it's usually done as kind of a throwaway or a very familiar kind of element.
Sure.
And I feel like sometimes in settings like this, in interviews, we don't really get to express the real beauty of the decision making and the not knowing and wondering that is part of making the film. You can't understand it just by putting the camera behind us. It actually takes some curation of the material and to help you understand and bring you into that moment. And so I'm like, hey, let's try this. And it was doubly fun because he mentioned you can get it on iTunes. It's an iBooks format, and what that means is we can use many different types of media, and we can build it on the page, design it on the page in any way we want.
Right.
And so that idea of how do we share this information in this really endless form was very exciting. And so I am as proud of the book as I am of the movie. I think it is just as unusual.
I think it's amazing. And it's when he launched it with the film's premiere at South by Southwest last March with just chapter 1, right? And it's sort of evolved into many chapters now and still has one more chapter left. So it's an interesting sort of evolution and growth in the way that we can sort of see the project grow as well through the process, which I think is really, really interesting. What about, you're so mellow, you're so chill, your movies just seem to flow flawlessly. What were some of the difficult? I mean, were there difficulties or the choices? Speaking of choices from the book, I mean, are there choices or things, decisions that you had to make that were just really difficult, or challenges you face in this 6-week shoot, which seems pretty remarkable, especially shooting
2
on
week.
film, or 2 week shoot, 6 weeks.
Yeah.
6 day weeks, but 2
Yeah.
weeks shoot. What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced, or was it as flawless as it seemed on film?
I mean, there always are challenges.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, we did so much of the work beforehand that let us just deal with the stuff that comes up. I also, I'm very sorry my collaborators aren't here, because they're very, I must shut this stuff out.
Yeah.
The heartbreaking events and the stressful moments, because they remember them all. And I find it wildly entertaining when they tell the stories.
Sure.
But I seem to have forgotten them all.
Yeah.
But I know that one of the things that made it work is, you know, you talked about this very small crew. And I think that one of the very beautiful things I felt in this crew is that, you know how everyone has that, you work in an office, you work in whatever, they have that bad moment, that bad day. And there are different ways you can deal with that. You know, you can ignore them, you can, whatever. What people did in this group that I think is the sign of a functional group is how well they took care of each other. You know, we didn't have a horrible moment because we all took turns breaking down.
Right,
And in those moments, the others would take care of us. And I think that the other thing is my style. I know myself enough that I need quiet. And so I think part of that relaxedness is that I just know that's the only way I can ever come up with an answer to anything. And so I just need quiet. And my AD knows that too.
Right.
It's like sometimes it's like when I ask you for a moment, be quiet.
Yeah.
Because it'll take Patrick a moment, but he'll get there. But he just needs the quiet.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. So you surrounded yourself with great people. Are these collaborators? Is it the same producers and the same sort of same DP from your
It's
first
some
film that have
overlap.
carried over?
Yeah, some of the same producer, same DP, a couple of the same designers, costume, makeup. Yeah.
And again, your first 2 films were self-financed. We all know sort of the downside of that, right? Are there some benefits to that? Is a third film going to be self-financed? Are you going after financiers for that one?
Yeah,
Tell us about the
I mean, the benefits to it are that you are free to the extent you'll let yourself be free.
Sure.
And I can make a lot of decisions aesthetically and also in kind of what I think of as morally for the release of the film.
Right.
That I couldn't, you know, if I had to answer to someone else. It only lasts for so long with no income. So it's, you know, this is the end of the self-financing road unless there's a windfall at some point. But I think that's okay.
Yeah.
I don't quite know how it's going to come together for this new one. I hope it will. You know, hopefully the public in France will help with some funding from France.
Okay.
But I think the thing I've tried to, the deal I've made is that I'm not trying to climb a budget ladder. My films essentially cost about the same, each to the next. And I make that trade-off for my freedom.
Right.
You know, and the idea is that, you know, it's not my first film. There's some confidence from what's come before.
Sure.
that I hope people have, some faith, and, you know, hopefully somebody will be wanting to go along for the ride. Just as low budget enough that curiosity is okay,
Right.
and can attract enough dollars to get the next pair made.
Yeah. Great. So we're going to open it up for a Q&A. I'm sure you guys are dying to ask Patrick some questions. We have a microphone in the back there, so if you guys have a question, if you guys can step to the mic, that would be fantastic. So if you guys have any questions.
Thank you so much for being such a great audience during this conversation. So patient. Hello.
Could you tell us a little about your process of working with children? Because it seems that you have a way with children, you get really good performances out of them.
Yeah. The trick is to remain a child. I had a kid in my first movie, and that kid was the age, I had taught kindergarten for a while, and so the kid was 5, 6, and I knew that age well. And I know that kids are often underestimated at that age, particularly when you're making a family movie. Kids see everything that's going on in family movies. And so for something like this, I feel like the most important thing for a child is to feel safe. It's kind of like in life, you know. They need to feel safe. You answer their questions. And if they're stumbling, you give them some ideas. And I think I had, for this, 2 very different kids. The leads, they were both Broadway vets. So they had no problem with the idea of performance. But they had very different styles. You know, Una is, the little girl is basically, she's like an 80-year-old woman in this tiny body. And she has almost never has any questions. And you're just so curious. You're like, did you really process all that we just discussed? You know, and well, not discussed, that I just told you. And she does. And she loves it. It's almost like the more you give her, the more she loves it, the challenge of piecing it all together. And Jeremy is wonderful because he's nonstop questions. You know, we basically have to stop him to shoot. But he is just so curious, and he has so many questions. And yeah, so I think for them, it's just to make sure they feel safe, and to give each what they need. And then everything else is just like working with an adult.
Have issues with patience as such, as in when you're doing like multiple shots? I thought children tend to lose patience a little quicker than adults.
I can see where that thinking comes from. For very young children, I think it's sometimes the opposite. They're, you know, you think how many young kids, they like to tell the same joke again and again and again. They like to do things. Repetition is a natural part of them. Sometimes you have to invite it in the same way. If you're forcing it, you know, then you run into problems. But if it becomes a game, the way they like to repeat things, then that's great. And then, but I think by the time you get to around the teenage years, it's not as much of an issue. And then it's just like an adult, where as long as they have your interest, you know, you have their interest, you're good.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hello?
Hi. So I actually have 2 things. One is just a comment. I thought it was really cool. You mentioned earlier how, there's, when you keep the camera on an actor, I mean, like, they'll show you the things that people might not say, or the decisions that they're making, like, or the decisions not to do something. And I thought it was really great when Gordy is like deciding what to say about his dioramas, his father's dioramas. Like, I can't remember a film in recent memory that like did that sort of thing, and I thought that was really cool. I really appreciated that part, like seeing his sort of like inner, like, you know, conflict. And then the other thing was, this is kind of a question, I mean, I guess, I don't know if there's a firm answer for this, but at the end of the film, when like it's just sort of the shot of the park as the family is leaving, I don't know if it was because, like you mentioned, the film had a mystery element to it, or just like, and it got my mind in that mindset, but people look for patterns in everything, and I looked at the characters that were showing up at the end, and like there was a girl who was like sort of jogging and like who sort of reminded me of Jess, and then there was like an old guy who like came and sat down, you know, just on like a stump or whatever, and I was like, that kind of looks like Gordy's dad. And like I was wondering if that was intentional or if that was just like me trying to find a pattern where it didn't exist.
I don't have an answer to that. I know that it wasn't consciously intentional from me, but I think that for somebody who grew up as such a clear director, everything was that I did was with intention when I was a young director, and it was so narrow because of it. I've mellowed out as I've gotten older, and I think that there's certain things that you do decide and you're not quite sure why, or maybe you realize many years afterwards why. And you know, just even down to before you get to the looks, but just what are the ages of the people in this scene is a question. And for some reason I had an answer. It seemed very natural to me, the distribution of ages, and then, so it's, yeah, I have a hard time. I know it wasn't conscious. I like hearing that response. And I did want to mention a little something about the first thing you mentioned. Oh, this idea of where the interesting stuff is and when people are responding. I have this theory about other movies that, you know, you take in a movie that wasn't particularly interesting to you. I suspect there's a cut of that movie that is quite interesting, because I think that actors are generally quite good, and I think their moments may not have been appreciated. Or sometimes what people do is they like it so much, they try to add to it, and they destroy it in the process. So I just have this suspicion a lot of that is in the footage for a lot of movies, but for some reason it doesn't really express itself in the end.
That's cool to think about. I think that speaks to your method of, like, I don't know if it comes from theater or what else, but the more relaxed sort of thing. Like you have something special as a director, I think, because of that perspective.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Hello.
Hello.
How you doing?
Good.
It's a great film. I loved it. I have a two-part question. The first question kind of informs the second one. The book, what point of view was it written in?
The book, that's a good question. It is third person, and it favors, I think, Ricky's story a little more than the film is a little more balanced between the perspectives.
Does it go into like Ricky's thoughts?
Yes. Yes, we have access to a lot more of Ricky's thoughts.
Because as I was watching it, when you would kind of do the visual collages, fading images over each other, I kind of wondered if that was your a way to show that introspection that you get from books, because people often say books are better for that reason. I think, like, you get into the heads of characters and you have time to ruminate on things, and I just wondered if that's what you wanted to do when you would hold out on things or show those image collages, if that's what you wanted to do with that.
Exactly. I think that I was trying to build the psychological space that, as you described, books are very good at leading us into. And I thought that we needed this kind of collision of things. And what is funny is that it looks the most cinematic, right? It's visual. But to me, it's the most rooted in theater. You know, we in theater often have simultaneous events on stage, and we're used to it. And we use that collision to tell a different story and to mean something. And yeah, and it's very hard, you know, obviously in a film, there are a lot of depths of feeling that Ricky has in the book that are, I find them, you know, maybe for lack of imagination, I find them hard to access. I can't imagine how we would spend time with that and communicate it in film. And so I think out of necessity, she became a little more balanced part of the story, and we tell more of her story through others. But yeah, everyone gets this kind of odd technique to access their psychological spaces.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, we can't take any more questions, but just a final thought on, you know, any sort of advice. There's some young filmmakers out there, obviously, and I think you've taken, like I said, a really unique, interesting journey and route through your career that serves as great sort of inspiration, I think, an example of how to approach your material, how to believe in your voice. But any final thoughts or advice that you want to sort of send out to the group about that?
You know, I've been asked this question before, and so I'll give an unoriginal answer.
Okay.
But it is, if I have to reduce it to the most important lesson I've learned, it is the observational stage for an artist is everything. And what I mean by that is I feel like we observe things, we process them, and then we decide what to do around them. And you'll have this on set. Something will go wrong, you know, something will be out of place, different than you were expecting. What happens is everybody rushes to fix it, align it with their expectations. And the idea is you already know. You make a film, it's to express all these things you already know. And I feel like the piece that is skipped over, the piece I love so much, is the part where you don't know, and it's not that it's just this wonderful ignorance, it is that you're observing. And you don't know with the intention like I want to know.
Right.
And I want to see what is happening here, why these things are happening. And so I think that that state of observing your characters, of observing your aesthetic, your material, processing, and then knowing is quite important, because that's what will change you.
Right.
Leah, who wrote this novel, she had a beautiful way of expressing it. She said that she doesn't start off with the idea to teach her audience something. She says it's a very condescending way to look at your audience. Mm-hmm. She says, the only way I feel like if I want my audience to expand in some way after reading my novels, I myself in the creation must expand. And the echo of that will echo in my audience. And that is how we communicate those great things. It's that we ourselves have learned and discovered something in this. It's
Sure.
not that we are teaching people this thing that we already know.
Right. It's great advice. Great advice. Thank you so much for bringing your film here. It was wonderful. And again, thank you guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Patrick.